Hey buddy, welcome back. As I mentioned in a previous video, we are slowly getting rid of things in order to sell our house. And again, the funny things you find when you are doing that. So this is the manual to a probably 1992 or 3 vintage Motorola StarTech flip phone. That's funny. It might have been the first truly portable telephone I owned. I had what was called a bag phone. First phone I had, which was essentially, you left it in the car. It was just like a base with a handset. I still have that thing somewhere. Today I thought we'd talk a little bit more about the Lumix 100 to 300 millimeter zoom lens. Primarily because I got at least one question about some of the previous images that I've shown taken with it, about which ones were taken wide open at 300 millimeters and f5.6. And I'll link to a previous video I did on this down in the description that has some examples of, has a test I did of the sharpness. And then to briefly review, what I found is that at f5.6, the lens, if you go online, people say, well, it's not that sharp. It actually is. There is somewhat of a contrast loss at f5.6, but it's still sharp enough. And what I thought I would do is do a little test. And I was reminded of this if you watch the Art of Photography channel with Ted Forbes, which is one of the channels that I subscribe to, and I really recommend that channel. He really knows his stuff. But he was talking about doing sharpness testing on lenses and mentioned this test that actually Roger Sakala at Lens Rentals on the Lens Rentals blog came up with. And I knew about this test, but I'd kind of forgotten about it. But you can take an image and put it into Photoshop and run a filter on it that's called Find Edges. And that's in the filters menu under Stylize. I'll put up a picture here of where you find it in that menu. And when you do that, you get this graphic representation of where the edges of the the sharp edges in the photograph are. And so what you do is if you take a picture of a plain area, and I used a lawn, a large lawn, and if you do that, you get this graphic representation of where the sharp edges are. And so it's really kind of a good way to test specific lenses for their sharpness. And it also will detect things like field curvature. So if you see it showing kind of a horseshoe in where things are sharp, you have some field curvature. And of course, field curvature can go either in or out. A lot of times that's why lenses are softer towards their edges, especially wide open, is that there's some field curvature. So what's in focus in the center isn't what's in focus at the edge. So without further ado, I'm going to show a quick little test that I did with that, and then also show real-world example of a wildlife image taken right over here in Thatcher Woods of a young white-tailed, I don't know how young he was, but it's spring. So a white-tailed deer buck, he's got antler nubs. And essentially go into what you can see as far as sharpness. Oh, and also I'm going to do a little bit about sharpening and noise reduction. I don't tend to really sharpen images a lot. When you bring a RAW file into Lightroom, there is a default level of sharpening. If Lightroom has a profile for your camera, when you bring that raw image in, there's going to be a default level of sharpening. There's also, at least with the Lumix cameras, a default level of color noise reduction. There's really no luminance noise reduction done. So, but it's easy to toggle that on and off to essentially see what the difference between having it applied and or not. Also, As far as noise reduction is concerned, I do not use any third-party noise reduction. I essentially use, in the details panel of Photoshop, I will use the noise reduction and sharpening there, and do my noise reduction and then mask the sharpening. So there is no sharpening on, smooth areas of the image, which would tend to enhance the noise there. If you want to learn more about how to do that, another great channel is Anthony Morganti's channel, where he does tutorials on Lightroom and Photoshop. I'll put a link to his tutorial on noise reduction and sharpening in Lightroom down in the description. So yeah, here's a little test I did. I'll be back with a follow-up. So here's the test scene. This is a lawn shot with the Lumix 100 to 300 millimeters, and this is the image at f5.6. And as I mentioned, if you put that image into Photoshop and use what's called the Find Edges filter, shown here, you'll get a representation like this. And this shows a graphic representation of the sharp edges in the image. If you look at this, you can see a line across the image showing where it's sharp, and it's sharpest in the center, as you would probably expect. It looks a little bit like it's a little less sharp at the left side than it is on the right side. So moving on, here is the lens stopped down to f6.3, and you can see there's a bit of a difference. It sharpens up further out into the corners, and of course there's a little bit of a broader area in focus, as you would expect. And here is the lens stopped down to f7.1, and same thing. It's a little bit broader area of focus. It's sharper out to the edges. But what's it look like in the real world? Because this is just giving you a representation, and the question is, can you notice this type of thing in an actual photograph? So let's take a look at that. Here's a white-tailed deer buck. It's morning. He's kind of backlit. Could use a catch light in those eyes, but oh well. And this is at f5.6 with the 100 to 300 at 300 millimeters, and it's I think acceptably sharp. This was shot at ISO 1600, but you notice the noise isn't really that terrible. This is with no noise reduction and no sharpening. Next, I'll just toggle the sharpening. This is the default sharpening, and the noise reduction and masking that I did, and I'll toggle that on. And you can see that it does an effective job of minimizing the noise, and the image sharpens up a little bit. And so I'll show you, here's a zoomed in view with no sharpening, no noise reduction. And here's with the default sharpening turned on and the noise reduction and masking of the sharpening. So I think, again, you can see that the Lumix 100 to 300 lens, which again is the most inexpensive option that you're going to have for a long telephoto in the Lumix or in the Micro Four Thirds system. Olympus has a 75 to 300 that is comparable. I don't know that much about that lens. I've never used it, but if you are interested in photographing wildlife or other natural things, and even some sports, this lens is fine. Wide open at 300 at 5.6, it's sharp enough. Is it as sharp as lenses costing many times more? No, but most people, when they look at a photo, let's just say you make an enlargement and you put it on your wall, there are very few people who are going to walk right up to it and go, "Oh, that's not as sharp as a Canon, 600 millimeter f4." Of course, it isn't. That's an L-class lens. But anyway, hopefully this was interesting, valuable to you. If it was, please pop that like button. I really appreciate it. It's a big help to me. If you are a subscriber, thank you for subscribing. I really appreciate it. And that's it for today. I'm Todd Banner. I will see you next time.